Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Unionizing the Games Industry panel. My name is Mais Robinson. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm going to be the facilitator. Thanks so much for joining us. Whether you're an active organizer who wants to learn more strategies, a veteran trade unionist with all the scars to prove it, or a worker curious about the rising tide of unionization in the games industry and tech industries, and wondering how you might be part of it. A union's power is in its members. So the discussion today is to empower you to join, organize, fight, educate, and continue the conversation beyond this room. We have some excellent panel members. So, representing the Games Workers branch of the IWGB, we have Secretary Luci Bran, he, him. We also have Christina Logan, she, her, who is the IWGB Games Workers Women and Non-Binary Workers Officer. And we have, representing UTAW, we have Eran Cohen. I'm just going to hand over straight away, and you're going to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your work. Yeah, perfect. So over to Christina.
Hi. I'm really bad with microphones, so let me know if I'm speaking too quietly. But I'm Christina. I'm from Belfast, Northern Ireland. I traveled over especially. I'm a freelance artist. I've been working in the games industry for about 5 years. Been a member of the union for maybe 4 of those years. I'm the Women and Non-Binary Officer, which is a bit of a mouthful, part of the elected committee. I'm doing organizer training 101 later. Please sign up, please. So it's not just me and Rosanna sitting in a room, like having a boogie. That would be really good. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Eran Cohen. I'm an organizer for UTAW, which is part of the CWU, and also the education officer for the National Committee, which means I get reps trained up, basically. I'm also usually a data scientist, and I work as a freelancer. And yeah, I think that's it for me.
Hey, yeah, I'm Luci. I'm a backend software engineer when I work for a living and the secretary of the union. I'm Romanian, if that matters to someone, and it's very interesting how much the trade union movement has grown in the industry. I really like that.
Great. So I've got some provocations, shall we call them, and then we'll hand over to a Q&A. So start thinking if you have anything to ask that's pressing. But to start with, I just thought it'd be useful to know what the most pressing issues for workers in the tech and games industry are at the moment. Who would like to start? Any thoughts? Yeah?
I mean, just going by what we've been seeing from the past year, redundancies are the big one right now. Initially, it looked like it was just from when What's Her Face tanked the economy, but then it turns out that Google was leading the way, and there was a lot of venture capital funds instructing the companies that they were funding to start making cuts. So it's like an orchestrated effort by the capitalist class in the sector, and it looks like it's coming in waves in a lot of the bigger companies who can't really get away with doing it all at once. And obviously, pay is a really big one because it's been stagnating, and then the 10% inflation has just really put people behind. I think those are probably the two main ones. But
Yeah, obviously the layoffs are a problem. They've kind of been spreading through contagion to the games industry to some extent, sort of an adjacent industry to tech in general. It is an excuse to discipline the working class, to depress wages, and it is a form of the class struggle from above. So we have to resist from below. Specific to the game industry, what has been the problem for years is crunch, as in a spike of significant, ridiculous overtime before something gets launched. And that is not as extreme as it used to be, but it's still a significant problem in the industry, and obviously made much worse by layoffs. So it's still not uncommon for a game to ship and for the team to be laid off after having worked significant overtime. And obviously, there's smaller, or not necessarily smaller, but less high amplitude things, like the sexual harassment problems in the games industry. There's the really big cases that make the news, and there's lots of horrible little ones everywhere. Um, and
Is crunch, is that contractual? Like, is it written into contracts, or is it something that's more covert?
it's rarely in contracts. Usually, it's the contracts tend to say no paid overtime, and that's about it. That's the most common thing. And then there's this kind of dance around skirting regulations around working too much. There's in the UK, there's a way to opt out of the maximum. Uh, yeah, as an individual worker, and companies tend to suggest that it's mandatory. That's fairly common. Usually, it's semi-voluntary. It's suggested that if you wanted a promotion or a raise that you really need because inflation, you really should be doing more. So it's very rarely explicit in a sort of legally enforceable way, even though often there will be the CEO mandating this has to be done by this. Everyone must work an extra whatever, and then it gets filtered down through the layers of management.
Yeah. The games industry is massively varied. So there's the £1 million companies, and then there's more where I work, which is more micro indie game companies. So there's going to be overlapping issues and also different issues as you go up and down. The biggest issue I see in my sector of the games industry is people not being paid at all sometimes, barely making minimum wage, um, not having legal contracts, not getting sick pay even though they're legal employees. Yeah, all kinds of fun stuff like that, which we might think that we're past because we kind of get grouped together with the tech industry. So we think maybe the problems are more sort of problems that companies with a lot more money are facing. But no, we're still working through things like artists not being able to afford to get the bus into work every day and things. There's also, Luci kind of touched on it, massive discrimination problems still. It's still a boys' club. And if you don't look a certain way, or act a certain way, you're probably going to get treated differently. And sometimes you're the only person in the company that looks or acts like that. There's nobody to support you or to believe you. So we're seeing a lot of gender discrimination cases, and we're seeing a lot of discrimination cases against neurodivergent people at the moment as well. So
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, one of the first things that made me think of, I work in the theatre industry, and a lot of the low pay or no pay work is kind of painted as exposure, or it's because it's a vocational industry. So people are there because they're passionate about those things, or they're artists, or they have something to say. And so that's really used against them in that way. I think that's probably one of the main struggles to unionizing or organizing in workplaces. But I was wondering if there was anything else that you could speak to about the main struggles with organizing.
I can go first again. I think for us, I don't know if it's necessarily a struggle. As an organizer, I've only worked in the context of remote organizing, which I think the vast majority of our workforce is either fully remote or hybrid. And that it's an interesting one because on the one hand, you can reach people at many hours as an organizer that you wouldn't expect to be able to reach them. You know, you don't need to stand outside a workplace with a clipboard and try and catch people going in and out. You can just message them. But on the other hand, there's the whole like dealing with how many different apps are we going to communications apps are going to get people on in order to be able to communicate with them, seeing as we can't be on the company Slack, but also because so many big companies like Monzo, for example, their Slack is huge, and it's basically almost like a social network in its own right, with all of the like stresses and pressures that come with being on a constantly on social network in a shift work company. So one of the hardest things that we're trying to come to terms with is how do the members as an organized collectivity decide like how to react to like management announcements or pronouncements in the announcement channel in a way that is as fast moving and dynamic as as this social media space is. Because it used to be like management would put something out by email to everyone. The union will have like a week to a month to discuss it, deliberate, and figure out what the response is going to be. Now it's like 24 hours or less. So how a committee functions in that environment is quite different from like the legacy of structures that we've been handed down. So that's personally one of the things that I've been struggling with organizing, is how do we reshape that so that workers have the tools to organize in that environment more effectively.
And is that related as well to the work that you're doing on surveillance?
Yes, yeah, it is, because both Teams, Microsoft 365, to a lesser extent Slack, give the admins the ability to monitor in different ways. I mean, Monzo is its own kind of beast. Like, they get monitored on 5-minute windows of mouse activity. So if you're inactive for longer than 5 minutes, for whatever reason, that gets flagged, just goes in a spreadsheet somewhere. It gets reviewed eventually. So we've had people going into disciplinaries of like, 3 months ago, where were you for these 15 minutes? And who could possibly know? Or also, like, I don't know, maybe I was taking a long shit or something. Like, it's not something that you can record. It's not something that the system lets you record either. So that granularity of surveillance is something else that we're seeing a lot of.
And there's also, it ties into what you were saying about accessibility as well. Maybe you do need more than 5 minutes away from your computer.
Oh, yeah, if you're going to work 8 hours in front of a computer, you're going to need more than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
You don't need more than an hour's lunch break as well. And yeah.
Anything else to add on struggles of organizing?
Yeah, so the remote thing is real for us as well. It's slightly different in that in the games industry, there's some disciplines where it is genuinely harder to work remotely. That you might need like 3 different consoles on your desk, dev kits to run something, and that might be difficult at home. And there's been a arguably stronger push to get people to come back in the office, and also less of a pushback from workers. But there's been some in some companies. But it is difficult to organize, not just remotely, but mixed as well, because some people will meet each other in the pub, and others are only on a Discord or whatever. And it's difficult to have a sort of bringing everyone together, which would have been implicit in person, and isn't, especially in a mixed environment. And what you mentioned earlier, people get told, "Oh, this is for exposure" or whatever. Absolutely, people in the games industry are exploited in addition, because they're expected to be excited. The idea is, well, there's going to be 20 younger people than you who are going to do this for almost free. And this especially happens to people that start working in QA, quality assurance, effectively testing the end result of the game for bugs. Very often they would very much like to be doing something else, but they take up this very badly paid job with lots of overtime to be able to move up into something, which doesn't always happen. And the other thing that's probably not specific to our industry is that there's a lot of variety between workplaces, and some are genuinely better than others, but it is difficult to get everyone unionized if the people in the workplaces that are comparatively better are going to say, well, mine is fine, because they will eventually have a problem with a decision management makes. And if they had built democratic power in the workplace beforehand, they would be able to say no. And also they would be able to shape the industry for the people in the much worse workplaces. But it's difficult to motivate people out of, well, it's kind of just about bearable, or maybe I even like it.
The idea of the good boss, the good CEO.
Yeah, all of that stuff. Some additional problems we have are, how do you unionize an industry that's exhausted and burned out all the time? We have so many members, and so a few of them have social battery to volunteer for things. It just feels like too much for them. It's almost like it's designed that way on purpose to stop people from pitching in. Another issue we have is there's almost like a taboo on unionizing, and we can't work out where it came from amongst people our own age. Why is it so, oh no, I don't want to be involved in that? If it's like propaganda that's been sinking down from like the previous generations or whatever, a lot of people are very scared to lose their jobs. There aren't a lot of jobs in Northern Ireland. Even in some of the areas of the UK that aren't London, there aren't a lot of jobs. A lot of the jobs are very competitive. People think if they start unionizing, they're going to lose their job. And they get scared. And it gets hard to have those conversations with people, even just to casually have those conversations with people, because they're scared for their job that they're supposed to be excited to have.
Yeah, I think I completely recognize that that feeling of competitiveness within an industry where jobs are scarce. Even though the industry is growing, the exploitation is so present that those jobs are so underpaid. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how we increase solidarity within both the tech and games industry. Also thinking about what you were saying about marginalized people being harassed in the workplace as well. Not just within organizing in the workplace, but also about the work that we're doing, the games that we're making. How can solidarity fit into those things?
Yeah, it is definitely hard to get people to care about things that don't affect them. What we found has worked well in a few places is to find something that people do care about. Find a coalition large enough on an issue that does affect a lot of other people, and try to organize around that. That ends up building some amount of democratic power within that workplace, and the people who have it worse are going to be able to talk about it somewhere. And it's difficult to not build empathy with someone that you've organized with for a bit and spend time with. It's unfortunate that it's difficult. As people make jokes about do the work, but it is ultimately that. For a workplace to care about those that are worse off in some way or other, they have to first be able to function as an organized group of workers. And it's always a case by case thing. Like what issue is particularly important here? Maybe there's like 3 of them, and 2 cover a minority of the people, and 1 of them covers everyone. So we're going to lead with that. We're going to advise the few people. Usually you have, like, as from the union's point of view, there's a few people in the workplace that join and they ask for help. So you might advise them, well, lead with this and also mention these other things that are also important. But make sure you lead with the thing that will get people to pay attention in the first place. And then you can teach them to care about the other things that will eventually affect them, but maybe aren't so obvious.
So on that, yeah, we found, I mean, speaking to our sister union in the US for Google, which is the Alphabet Workers Union, they organize both what were until the redundancies, the permanent safe staff in Google, the ones with the 6-figure salaries, but also the VTC, so vendors, temps, and contractors who are extremely exploited. And what they found is if they can get both of them in a room through the union for an issue that both are affected by, there's a bit of a synergy because the VTCs tend to be more militant because they're more exploited, but they feel empowered and safer for having the permanent staff in the room. And this in turn also pulls the permanent staff who have more power in the company because they're not as easily replaceable to use that power to gain leverage. And that's something that, like, sorry, I do this all the time, but there's, like, in theory, this is, like, I think covered by, like, Gramsci and, like, other thinkers from that, of, like, we have to build coalitions of not just build coalitions around issues, but also educate the different sections of that coalition about where their power is. So really early on in our union's days, we did a bunch of events called workers' inquiries, where you have a well-constructed questionnaire that people work through in groups that explores where their power is in the workplace, where they're exploited in the workplace, where are the bottlenecks, So people can see very quickly, oh, actually, me and my colleagues in this team could shut down the company or in this way. Not that we're talking to people about strikes at such an early stage, but for people to be able to see their power helps them imagine how they can stand up in solidarity with others. So once you've already got that first step of like an issue that everybody shares and cares about, and then you can show them that they could actually do something about it, regardless of whether they're highly exploited or not highly exploited, and whether they're highly replaceable or not highly replaceable, then you can transform that coalition, or you crystallize that coalition into an entity that sees itself as having power. So that's where like a lot of our work goes in, say, for example, in very large companies where there's also like customer support and development and backend and stuff like that, is to organize both and build bridges between the two. And very often they're very separated as workforces. Yeah.
How much appetite is there to make those connections? Do you have to really encourage it, or are people like ready to build those bridges?
It kind of depends on the company. I think one of the interesting things that I wanted to speak to something you said before is that like there's companies where it's a real cult and you have to like drink the Kool-Aid and really care about the company to work there. And then there's companies where it isn't. So I mean, Apple is a great example. But like counterintuitively, in those companies where it is cult-like, actually there's a lot more solidarity between the different sections of the workforce already, because they care about the product and they care about the company and they feel like it's a family and all that shit. So whereas in companies where it's just a day job for people, there can be a little bit more like individualism and like people just seeing themselves just in terms of like, well, I just do engineering and I'm just here to do the engineering, and like the customer support people are just another part of the company that I don't think about. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of marginalized folks, it's really difficult to build solidarity in an industry that is predominantly young straight white guys. It's this whole thing of, well, how do we make them care about us when they don't even see the issues that are going on? A lot of them don't even think to ask, what issues are you going through? Like, as a marginalized person, they just assume that everything's okay because they haven't heard of anything going on. So it's quite hard. A lot of people only join a union when something bad happens to them, because that makes it real suddenly. There's a lot of people who just, it's not like a selfishness, it's just they didn't prioritize that in their mind. So recently I've been trying to focus on making sure that all of the marginalized people are supporting each other and that we're not relying on anybody. We've been building connections within the IWGB, all the different branches. So there's people facing like sexual harassment in the games industry. Well, we go to the people who work in the cleaners branch that have experience with that stuff and they've run successful campaigns in that stuff. So rather than relying on people who will never experience sexual harassment to try and give us power, we're trying to find it within ourselves and make sure we're not relying on that. Because you can't really teach people empathy, but if there's enough of you talking about your problems, they're more likely to listen.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you were saying about this like company culture of being a family, and yet so much of that is missing. But how can we utilize that family structure to actually push forward with this organizing and pushing marginalized people to the front of that? I think it's always useful to talk about the structure of unions and branches and how organizing actually works within that structure, because for some people who haven't engaged with unions before, that feels kind of mysterious, or their role within it feels confusing. So yeah, if you could just chat a little bit about, just brief us on what the structures of your union are, that would be helpful, I think. Yeah.
Sure. Do you mean the structure of the whole union as it is, or the structures that we move people into as we organize?
The second.
The second, okay. So, I mean, for example, you would have a small group of people from a new workplace joining. that'll be maybe just one really motivated person or a handful of people, only some of whom are motivated, and then it's a matter. It's then the organizer's job of giving them the skills and the resources that they need to recruit colleagues and to set up a structure. So in my experience, that structure doesn't come along immediately. It first is just it's necessarily ad hoc because it's people using their personal relationships with each other to bring them into the union and to figure out what are our issues. Rather than and I'm also a big opponent of the field of dreams, if you build it, they will come model, because I think anyone who spent any time in the left in the UK knows that doesn't really work. But there's like this tendency to do that from a bunch of different disciplines, for lack of a better word, within the left, flavors. So I've always in UTAW consciously tried to avoid doing that, both when organizing and in the wider higher level union structures. I think it's better to let the social network of in the workplace or in the union sort of cohere, try and like tackle some problems, that whatever problems is designed to tackle, whether it's like surveillance or workplace organizing, and then from the shape that it starts to take, you sort of sit down and figure out what makes sense here. So in some workplaces, we only need like 1 to 3 reps to be the committee, and that's it, because you're maybe not dealing with more than like 100 people, and they don't need that many reps. On the other hand, workplaces with thousands of people, there are loads of remote teams getting spread out. You need proper structures, in which case you can do it the old-fashioned way with a committee with a bunch of roles, or you can have like one of the models we're experimenting with now is a chair and a vice chair, and then a casework reps team and an organizing reps team, and it's the chair and the vice chair's job to like almost be like the meta part of that structure of just like making sure people are doing the teams are performing the functions they're supposed to be doing and giving them the resources to do that, and making sure that meetings and like workplace democracy happens, or member democracy happens. But it's those teams that are actually doing the bread and butter of organizing and casework and stuff like that.
But then making sure that those things happen is not punitive. It's not like a boss-like structure. It's actually, if those things aren't happening, how can we offer more resources? How can we support people better?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this even in like a classic capitalist firm, when you have good management, what that actually means is that the managers realize that their job is to help the workers do their job. It's not to like go around micromanaging and telling them what to do. The best bosses I've had, sorry, this is maybe the wrong place to say those two words together, are ones who understand that and who give you the autonomy that you need to do your job and to do it well. So I think there's like a similarity in an abstract way between these two kinds of structures.
Yeah, so we do things quite similarly in terms of workplaces. And yeah, when a workplace is really small, they're not going to have somebody doing casework. That'll be the branch supporting them. So for the most part, it's the branch filling in for functions that are not yet solidified and grown within that workplace's union members. So it's not so much that we from the branch would tell the committee in a workplace, don't do that. It's more that usually there's no one that is doing a particular thing. So somebody will fill in from the branch if that's necessary. I don't think we've ever had to use any disciplinary function in terms of somebody doing something horrific that was a representative of the workplace. And although that's entirely possible, it will happen one day. But for the most part, it is that, filling in, because a union is a group of workers acting together. That's all it really is. And that is centered around the workplace. And the branch's job is to get every workplace in the industry to that point. That's the ideal. When you get there and all of the workplaces are linked together by the branch existing, or whatever, however the central mechanism is, that's when you have an organized industry. That's when you can have like sector level bargaining or whatever. But it always starts from the workplace, because like what you were saying, that is where the power comes from. Withdrawing labor is the ultimate power workers have. Just don't do your job, and there is nothing the employer can necessarily do about that. They can get around it, they can try to fire you, whatever. But withdrawing your labor is your ultimate power, or industrial action in general. And getting the people in a workplace to understand that and to feel that power and to actually use it and wield it, that is the ultimate goal. Because everything else will come after. Like the sort of, it's absolutely important to have some amount of structure so people know what they should be doing if they have a particular goal to reach, or to figure out, like, is this union accidentally doing something that the other union would be hurt by. But that is kind of secondary to the workplace being organized, and ultimately reducing the alienation people have between them and any sort of democratic power in the workplace.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, from the outside looking in, it might seem like there's a lot of complicated structures and things, but ultimately all our union is a bunch of group chats. And you have your work group chat, and then you might have your regional group chat, and then you have the large group chat, and everything feeds back into the large group chat. So it might seem like there's a lot of rituals and mysterious things happening, but that's not the case. Like, all organizing is speaking to the people that are working beside you and asking if there's any issues, finding out if you have the same issues, and then doing something about it. So I know it can look like there's a bunch of people that know what's going on, but actually, like, the branch is very new still. Other branches within our union are also very new, and a lot of people don't really have an idea of what's going on, but they're just really happy to be there and to be trying to help people, and that's what's most important. So yeah, it's just a case of, like, do you have some spare time? Why don't you say yes to doing something? Why don't you say yes to sending a message to someone and seeing how they feel? And then that turns into, why don't you say yes to having a meeting in person and speaking to people? And then eventually that turns into something larger and you have a brunch. So
Yeah, I think that also speaks to what you were saying about burnout as well. Is as union members, we need to get better at addressing that, but also part of that is committing to union work or your other fellow workers in varying ways. So being part of those chats can mean answering questions. It can mean supporting someone on an emotional level rather than like on a worker's level, right? Or it can mean coming up with an idea and then seeing it through. I think maybe we'll go for a Q&A if anyone has any questions. Yeah, so the question was about mergers and losing jobs because of it and what our response would be. Or I don't know whether there already is a response being built or whether this is something that's like happening right now.
I'm going to let you take it. This is a specifically game sector.
Yeah. So in general, a union can have a response if it has organized workers in a particular place, like an actually effective material response. We do often, or not often, a few times we have had workplaces attempting to do redundancies, legally or not. One case that was quite publicized was Lockwood, this games company that wanted to fire 30-something workers, which is illegal in the UK to fire that many without a consultation. So what effectively happens is the workers that are affected are going to be motivated to mount a response. That tends to be a campaign of some sort to get the company to care. So in the case of Lockwood, there were some amount of publicity around, look, this company is doing this thing that's illegal, getting journalists or MPs or whatever that might be sympathetic to publicize this further, to get some amount of public attention on it. And in that case, a lot of the workers got a pretty good redundancy package. A lot of the redundancies were actually reversed. Some people chose to find different jobs. Ultimately, the outcome depends on the power, on worker power within that workplace. As far as I know, in the case of Xbox and Blizzard, in the US, there's some amount of organization on that. I'm not aware of what exactly is being done, but I would expect something similar where the workers affected would use what power they have at their disposal at the moment. But it really depends on that. It's entirely possible for workers to not be able to mount enough public pressure, to not have enough workers that could potentially strike, to harm the company enough to change its plans, and then that's just it. A lot of workers will get made redundant. Unfortunately, that does happen. It is class warfare ultimately, and it is a fight every time. I hope in this case it will go better than others, and there's a chance it could. And a lot of the times, the company is kind of gauging just how much it can get away with in terms of what it's describing. Oh, we want to lay off this many people. Actually, they don't really care about laying off that many, but they're sort of starting the negotiation strong. So from the workers' point of view, again, if there are enough in that workplace and organized enough, can be, well, maybe don't, and then something in the middle usually happens. Because ultimately, we are functioning in a capitalist society, and yes, we are building democratic workers' power, but in the small and in each workplace. So we're not going to have, it's going to be rare that we have absolute victories until we can like in the case of Activision Blizzard, if we were extremely well organized as workers, we could say, well, we're going to do a general strike. We're going to go through the TUC or whatever. And if this happens, no more workers in the whole country, right? That would be amazing, but that's not where we are. So it basically, it depends, and I know it's not a satisfying answer, but it very much depends on the balance of power within that workplace. Oh, sorry.
No.
Yeah, that was everything that I would have said. Ultimately, we can't act on behalf of people who aren't members. All we can do in some cases is educate, which is why it's important to join a union when things are good. So yeah, that's all. Luci covered it really well.
Yeah, I think it's also worth recognizing that unions also have resources available to them that we don't as individual workers or even collective workers. So, you can have a union rep sitting in on your negotiations with employers and advising you. You can have support with legal action. You can have the legal department giving you advice or working with you directly. So there's lots of options. I think it's also open to imagination as well. So the workers who are in those workplaces know that structure the best, and they know their value the best. And so that's why it's really important for the people in the workplaces to be pushing those things through. Did we have another question at the back?
We did start talking about it earlier because, with the move to hybrid and remote, it's not so much a matter for an organizer or an organizing member of being in the physical workplace to chat to people. It's very much about reaching out through the workplace Slack or Teams and then through outside of it. So there's a bunch of different tactics that we found help. It's always imperative to... Are you familiar with the ladder of engagement from marketing? This is very, very helpful. Basically, if you give someone a flyer in the street, that's the first step. If they take it, they've gone one level up the ladder of engagement. Then they might go to your website. That's another one, and you can just keep building that up. So you want to set up something like that where you've got your members talking to people about the union. That engagement is the first step. And then trying to get them into a WhatsApp group or a Signal group or a Discord outside of workplace communications is essential. Partly because if it's a very draconian management, they might just start heavily moderating Slack or even just shut stuff down completely, and you'll lose access to your members will lose access to being able to talk to their colleagues as easily. So moving as many people as you can onto a separate one is important. And then that's intermediate, because once people join, you want them to be in a much more secure place where, by virtue of people being members, you can more or less trust that they're not like leaking stuff back to management. Obviously, you never have 100% operational security, but you can definitely like build that into the design. So that's one thing that we found helpful with remote organizing. The other one is being online a lot, having so many communications apps. You have to have as much variety as an organizer in your communications apps as you've got workers using different communications apps, basically. But at the same time, you can't expect people who are mostly just using Slack to then also be on a WhatsApp group, but then also on a more secure Signal group, but then also on the Union Discord. That is just way too much. So while we're building in those like engagement steps with different groups, we have to like try and minimize the number of apps that we've got people on, because I can't remember what the word is in tech for that, but there's like people start disengaging once they have to be on more and more different communications platforms. Yeah.
Like oversaturation.
Oversaturation, yeah, that's it. Yeah. Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar for us. We have a similar kind of thing where we advise workplaces to have a Discord or whatever makes sense for them that is not necessarily just members, but people who are likely to become members, are likely not to snitch or whatever. And then separately from that, we have the union-run Discord where only members are, and that's separate. So we try to keep things small as well. It's difficult. Some things are harder if you're doing hybrid, because some people will meet in person and the others will not, and they're not going to have the same conversations. And there's a few tactics that work. Frankly, nothing works perfectly. But there's a bunch of upsides as well. Everyone is comfortable and familiar with having a meeting on Zoom or similar. So we run our branch meetings for the game workers branch, which covers the whole of the UK. We run them on Zoom, and that means nobody has to travel anywhere for the monthly branch meetings. And we've actually increased attendance quite a bit because of that. And we try to keep the regional stuff focused on in-person events and the national branch meeting on Zoom. So that's kind of an advantage, because there's no competition in terms of in-person events. They're always regional, and there's no competition in terms of with the branch meetings. That's all. Well, there's some, as in there's only so much energy people have, but that is always online. You don't have to travel. So in some ways, some lines have been made clearer by this, which has helped a bit.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting that a lot of the mediums that you're using are familiar to people in a social setting. So for new members or potential members, that's actually quite a comfortable space to come into, whereas, a branch meeting that's in person can feel quite intimidating in many ways. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, so there's never a perfect solution, but our branch has a women and non-binary officer and a BAME officer who stands, and they put themselves out there to be approached if someone needs to speak about a specific issue. I can only speak for women and non-binary myself. I'm always there if someone wants to speak. A lot of the elected committee are men, so it might be quite hard. I find a lot of them are really even just scared to talk in the Discord itself. So for my year as being the women and non-binary officer, I've been messaging people one-to-one and seeing how things are, trying to speak to them in a way that's less intimidating than shouting into a room full of people that don't look like them. And we've found success in that, building people's confidence to come out and say, this is what I'm going through. And in the Discord itself, it's really intimidating, but when people do come with their issues, no one's ever dismissive that I've seen. I keep a really close eye on that stuff, making sure that people are being heard. And they are, so it is an uphill battle. It's just making sure that people on the elected committee, there's people that they can see themselves in that, and they feel represented. They feel like there's somebody there that they can speak to that might understand. So keeping the diversity of our elected committee is really important. Trying to make sure that the space is friendly and open and psychologically safe, but there's never going to be a perfect answer to that. So we're trying our best, but we feel sometimes.
So the way we do it in UTAW, we have a few different mechanisms. I mean, at the very top level, we can see from our membership system what our proportion of BAME and women and non-binary members are in the membership as a whole, and then in the committee, and we can at least try and match that. Thankfully, it's always been almost bang on, so we've never had to do like a lot of work. So we don't have, for example, protected seats, even though personally I'm a big fan of protected seats in organizations. I know that the union we're part of, CWU, does have that on the NEC, and for the different constituencies like postal and telecoms. So, I mean, inshallah, one day we will have these if we need them, but for the moment we haven't needed them. But that's at the very top level. And then in the medium, so we've got caucuses like you've got. So we have the BAME caucus, the Women and Non-Binary caucus, the LGBTQ caucus, and the Disabilities and Neurodiversity caucus. I think those are, and we've got a youth one, which I don't know if that's per se like an equalities caucus, but there it is anyway. And they all have their own officer whose job it is to make sure that that those members' voices are being channeled to the correct like places in the union democracy when needed, but also to just build up those networks within the union. So that's like the middle level. And then at the workplace level, it's partly it's to do with the workplace, but for example, when we do come across racism or unconscious bias, which is a big one in tech, or any of the other forms of oppression, then we'll always make sure to call it out. Very often there's like a tendency when people are like cautiously organizing rather than loudly organizing to not really tackle that stuff head on and publicly. And it's very often it feels like you're making a tactical decision to focus on organizing and not to put yourself out there too much. But I think that's often flawed, and actually the flip side gets you more credibility gets your members more credibility as the union there, because they will stand up for the right thing regardless of whether it's likely to get them more in trouble. So very often we will encourage members to, on company Slack, call stuff out when it happens publicly rather than try to resolve it informally or then through the grievance procedure. Use the grievance procedure by all means, but do it really publicly and like hold whether it's management or whether it's another colleague to account. Obviously, when it's a manager versus a colleague, the approach might differ, and that is very contingent on the situation in that company. But I think very often taking the approach of calling stuff out publicly it's both the right thing to do and it's better for organizing.
When you say publicly, do you mean within the union?
Well, in this place, I'm looking at the level of the workplace, so like within the workplace. Okay. If we also thankfully haven't had any of that within the union. We have had feedback to, for example, cis white men with strong personalities who kind of dominate the room, and as with in all other contexts, sometimes people take that feedback on board and amend their behavior, and it's very positive. And sometimes people just rage quit, and there's not really. You can sometimes predict by personality, but either can happen. But the fact that we have at least a culture of people speaking out when they see behavior like that, that works really well. And I think also inculcating that culture by having a committee that supports it when it happens and doesn't try to mediate by silencing those discussions and silencing that kind of criticism just goes a long way to doing that. Because when people see that, like, if I call out this person for something that they said, people with authority in the branch are going to agree with me, then you're more likely to have that behavior repeated over and over again. So, like, you don't get dirt on your face if you keep washing it, kind of thing. And I think that's also a lot more important than representation, because, like, I mean, representation is important, but at the end of the day, like, Rishi Sunak is representation. Where does that get you? And, like, Theresa May was representation. Where does that get you? So you've got to have it in the culture, which is a very hand-wavy term in organizations. But if you can get to grips with that, then you're going to have, you don't even need representation necessarily, because even if the entire committee was like straight white men, if it's in the culture to call shit out, then they're going to be called out a lot, or they're going to be good, or good allies is what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when you're saying calling out, what I'm hearing is setting clear boundaries about what is and isn't okay, what's still. I think it's important to assume good faith. So if someone, everyone is willing to learn and wants to learn, maybe uses the wrong word but is ready to apologize and learn from that. I'm curious to hear how you deal with that, the kind of second thing that comes after that, which is education, and who educates people on those issues. We don't want to, there's a balance between allowing someone to be an expert of their own experience as a marginalized person, but also not having to take on the weight of educating people. Who do you think has that responsibility amongst workers, amongst members?
Well, I always say nothing about us without us. You don't want to be making a judgment on a group of people without direct input from those people. I think it's incredibly important when you're taking any kind of action to benefit a group of marginalized people that you make sure that it's something they actually want. Obviously, person to person, everyone's going to have different ideas about what they want and what they, how they want to be represented. But it's always important to have those conversations, take those people aside. Democracy, obviously, everything we do gets voted on. So that's something that's in place to make sure it's not just someone's best idea of what should happen being put forward. But yeah, I think it's always important to speak to those people, get their actual genuine opinions, even if they're too scared to speak out in a group, which is why speaking one-to-one is important. I think even if everybody has the greatest intentions, when they're kind of working from their own assumptions, those can go horribly wrong often, which is why I think it is really important to have the representation amongst people who are in the position to get the ball rolling on things. Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, I have a straightforward answer to the question, which is just the first people who I would expect to go and speak in private to someone who has said something bad would be the officers in charge of that equality strand. And I hear you about, it's not your job as a black person to educate people about anti-black racism, and I agree with that, but not for role holders, for people who have chosen to have like elected responsibility. That would be my first person to go to check, like, is this person being dealt with? Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think this is why organizations have caucuses or advisory groups or whatever for groups that are typically underrepresented, and the role of those groups tend to be to democratically represent the minority and advise whatever group is in charge, whatever executive elected committee or whatever, to act in their interests as well, because yes, it is easy to miss them. And the sort of the extent of that structure depends on how far you got, like how much it's actually needed. Different organizations have different amounts of structure and slightly different ones. Ultimately, the people that do something are the ones that care about it. So it's difficult to get past the need for someone who suffers from a problem actually explaining it to at least one other person. But it is important to build a culture of caring about that. It's important how you chair meetings as well. It's easy to accidentally give people too much room when they don't really need it, and it's not easy but important to sort of prove to those that might feel uncomfortable talking that it's fine. And this is where the people that are very little marginalized is important for them to explain, and as an example where it doesn't hurt you. Like Eastern Europeans are treated differently in Britain, but it's nothing like having a different skin color. And until I open my mouth, nobody pays attention to that. But I use it as an example to explain to others that, look, this is a small thing that I notice sometimes. There's probably something else that you would notice. You should at least remember that for others, it's much worse all the time. And just don't forget. And here's an example. And usually somebody else will come and say, oh yeah, here's my experience. That is worse, you're right. And also similar in this aspect. And I think that that's useful. But it's also important, I was going to bring up Thatcher, which is the classic example, that representation doesn't really do anything ultimately by itself. It can be a tool to achieve a goal, but it can also be a tool to pillage the working class, which is what's happening today in Britain. So ultimately what matters is the material condition of the working class. And certain subsets of the working class do have it worse. And in my opinion, it's important to start from there. The fact that, yes, women are poorer for loads of reasons, and we start from the material condition and organize around improving that. And the rest of it kind of falls into place because, yes, everyone wants their material condition improved, and we can all work towards that, and it affects different people differently, and it looks different, and different groups of people might need extra resources compared to others, but ultimately we're all doing the same thing, and I think that tends to help to sort of try to explain it in terms of class so that everyone, for the most part, gets it more easily.
Thank you. I think we might have run out of time, actually. But I'm sure if people have pressing questions, then we can continue this conversation outside. Do you want to just do any plugs or tell people where they can find more information? If they want to start organizing within their workplace, how would they go about doing that practically?
It would be really cool if someone was running a workshop on this exact thing. So yeah, come to our workshop later and learn what your first steps are, why you should take them, and things to say to people when you feel like you're not very good at speaking or convincing people of anything. You can find us on our website, which I'm going to pass the secretary to tell us.
Yeah, so you can Google us as well. But yes, you can join us on our website if you would like. There's a bunch of information about what we do. We organize game workers in general, primarily video games people, a few people that work on board games. There's obviously a bit of overlap with UTAW, which I will pass on to talk about.
Cool. Yeah. So United Tech and Allied Workers is the branch of the CWU. You can find us at utaw.tech. We have a very broad definition of a tech worker. So if you work for a if you make money for a tech company, or if you work with tech tools, even if you're the digital content creator for some company that otherwise is not in tech, you're a tech worker. So we organize all of those people. We do send games workers in their direction. And yeah, we've been growing a lot, and it's really great to see so many people coming into events like this and thinking about how to get organized, both in the game sector and in the tech sector. So yeah, I'm going to be around for a little bit, and our chair, Matt, is over there in the black UTAW shirt, if you want to speak to either of us. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, look out for the merch. Yeah, thank you so much. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists.